Today we are looking at a comprehensive breakdown of NASA's revised lunar architecture, covering the newly announced Ignition project, the phased development of the Artemis base camp, and the specific functional gaps required for long-term lunar and Mars-forward operations.
Lots of ground to cover today.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's immediately look at the section discussing the technical modules and, well, how this dense hardware information is actually organized for the reader.
Right, the layout.
Exactly. So, to give some context on the current layout, the text intersperses highly specific technical parameters for lunar hardware with these really dense, narrative-heavy paragraphs about high-level policy changes.
It's a lot of mixed information.
It really is. For example, we get the specifications for the Lunar Terrain Vehicle, the Habitable Mobility Platform, and the Foundational Surface Habitat all kind of jumbled together.
And the contractor details too, right? Like the European Space Agency and JAXA?
Yeah, exactly. JAXA and the Canadian Space Agency, plus targeted launch dates like Artemis 7 in 2029. But right in the middle of these hardware specs, the text just dives into the programmatic storytelling of how the new NASA director, Jared Isaacman, canceled the Lunar Gateway and shifted $20 billion to the Ignition project.
Which is a huge policy shift to just drop in the middle of hardware specs.
Right. Right now, it feels a bit like reading a captivating history book that suddenly inserts a page from a car engine repair manual. The reader has to completely shift their cognitive gears.
I mean, that's a perfect analogy. The current presentation of the Artemis Base Camp modules and highly technical data alongside broad strategic narratives makes rapid visual scanning and comprehension challenging for the reader.
It really does. It's just hard to sift through.
Yeah, the weakness here is that essential technical data, such as launch vehicles, international contractors, and targeted deployment dates, is practically buried.
Buried under all that narrative.
Exactly. A technical reader or, an engineer looking for the hardware specifications of the Habitable Mobility Platform has to dig through programmatic storytelling about Jared Isaacman's policy shifts and the fallout of the gateway cancellation just to find what they need.
So how do we fix that layout issue?
Oh, okay. So just pull the data entirely out of those paragraphs?
Yeah. As a concrete example, create a dedicated hardware spec sheet section. Strip out the bullet points for the LTV, HMP, and surface habitat from the narrative entirely, and place them into a clean comparative table with dedicated columns for module function, international partner or contractor, and target phase.
That makes a lot of sense. Just clean up the visual space.
Right. Furthermore, instead of listing functional gaps linearly in the text, use bolded call-out boxes for tags like FNM304 for mobility in permanently shadowed regions or FNL203 for transferring water to habitable assets. Oh, so technical readers can easily scan the page for those specific engineering constraints.
You got it. It makes it instantly readable.
I see the logic of cleaning up the page, totally. But I do have a concern about stripping out the hardware specifications.
Oh, what's your concern?
Well, if we isolate the Canadarm3 or the Thales-Alenia space communications modules into a sterile table, don't we risk losing the sheer drama of those components being repurposed from a canceled orbital space station to a surface base? I mean, we want to maintain that strategic context, right?
That's a fair point, but document design should give the reader control over how they consume the information, rather than forcing them to parse two distinct types of data simultaneously.
Okay, but how do we keep the narrative and the specs connected if they're separated?
We can maintain the strategic context through brief cross-referencing or hyperlinking, effectively tethering the narrative to the data without tangling them together.
Oh, I see. Just a quick call out in the text.
Exactly. In the narrative text detailing the gateway cancellation, the author can write, hardware originally slated for orbit, such as the Halo module's communication links, will be repurposed for the surface base. See Table 1.2 for the revised surface habitat specifications.
That's a really elegant solution.
It really is, because this allows the narrative to flow uninterrupted, focusing heavily on the reasons behind the policy shift, while the table serves as the definitive, easily accessible reference.
It coasts out of the managing cognitive load, honestly. I mean, the human brain processes narrative storytelling like the reasons why a $20 billion reallocation happened using entirely different pathways that it uses to process tabular, binary data like mass limits or launch dates.
Absolutely.
When you mix them in a single paragraph, you force the reader's brain to constantly context switch, which just induces reading fatigue.
We see this often in engineering documentation, actually. An author tries to be comprehensive by putting every known fact into a single sequential narrative.
Just dumping everything onto the page.
Right. But a reader reviewing the Artemis 3 Science Definition Team report is scanning for entirely different information than a reader looking up the payload capacity of the commercial lunar payload services. By separating the formats, you respect the differing needs of your audience.
Yeah, well said. So we've solved how the reader navigates the raw data on the page. But there's a bigger navigation problem here, which is how the reader navigates the logic from one policy to the next.
The transitions, right?
Exactly. Let's look closely at the section discussing the major section transitions. The material moves from detailing the foundational science objectives straight into the programmatic shifts, and I read this and felt complete whiplash.
It is a bit jarring.
Specifically, the text details the need for real-time data transmission and in-situ imaging requirements during extravehicular activities. It emphasizes high-bandwidth communication and cross-directorate integration between the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate and the Science Mission Directorate.
Right, setting up all the science goals.
Yes, and then, almost immediately in the next paragraph, the text jumps to the sudden cancellation of the Lunar Gateway and the introduction of the Ignition Project's 3 phases.
Yeah, that leap is huge.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that the science requirements directly drive the architecture. But right now, the leap from, we need high bandwidth communication to Jared Isaacman canceled gateway feels like we skipped a crucial chapter.
The causality is completely opaque.
Exactly.
The transitions between the foundational science objectives and the recent programmatic shifts feel abrupt, disrupting the logical evolution of the lunar architecture.
There's just no bridge between the two ideas.
Right. The weakness in this section is that the material shifts gears without providing the necessary connective tissue that explains why the science needs necessitated such a massive programmatic pivot.
Right. It just feels like two unrelated events.
As a reader, I am left wondering how the cross-directorate integration and the intense need for pre-positioning science assets actually relate to the newly proposed 3 phases of the moon base. The reader is presented with isolated facts. A happened, then B happened, but the cause and effect relationship is entirely missing.
So what's the most effective way to fix that?
Introduce explicit bridging paragraphs at the end of major sections that clearly and directly connect the underlying functional or scientific requirements to the subsequent programmatic decisions or infrastructure phases.
Okay, give me an example of what that bridge would actually say.
For example, when transitioning from the science traceability matrix to phase 1 of the Ignition project, write a transition that says something like, to achieve these rigorous real-time data and in-situ imaging requirements within the newly allocated $20 billion budget, the architecture shifts to the Ignition project.
Oh, connecting the budget to the science requirement directly?
Exactly. And then follow it up with, consequently, Phase 1 relies heavily on uncrewed commercial lunar payload services to lay the foundational power and communication networks required by the science definition team.
Wow. That framing turns a sudden topic shift into a logical consequence. It positions the cancellation of the gateway not just as a political whim of a new director, but as a mathematically and scientifically necessary decision to achieve the defined goals.
In technical writing, authors often default to chronology rather than causality. They report the events in the exact order they were announced by NASA.
Right, a timeline of press releases.
Exactly, but readers need a web of consequences. If the science definition team mandates extensive real-time data transmission from the lunar surface and the existing mass allocations on the human landing systems are insufficient for those antennas, which the text does explicitly note elsewhere, then the author must actively guide the reader to the inevitable conclusion.
Connect the dots for them.
Yes. The text needs to bridge the gap by stating, because the orbital gateway couldn't facilitate the surface-heavy data requirement efficiently, the infrastructure was redirected strictly to the lunar South Pole.
It's about building an unbroken chain of evidence. I might understand what the science traceability matrix is, essentially the master checklist of scientific goals, right?
Right.
But if the text tells me the goal is to pre-deploy a cache of tools and instrumented rovers for environmental monitoring It has to smoothly link that goal to Phase 1's specific mandate to increase the payload mass capability to 5 metric tons. The reader shouldn't have to guess why the payload mass requirement suddenly jumped.
And building those bridging paragraphs actually elevates the authority of the entire document. It stops reading like a Wikipedia summary of separate NASA announcements and becomes a cohesive, persuasive argument about the future of human spaceflight.
It totally changes the tone.
It really answers the critical "so what" at every single stage of the architecture's evolution.
That actually brings us to the final challenge we wanted to discuss today, which is building a cohesive roadmap. I struggled heavily with the very end of this document.
The appendix section.
Yeah, a key theme running through all these pages seems to be progressive capability. Starting small, building surface infrastructure, and eventually looking toward Mars.
Phased growth, basically.
Right. But after reading about all these phased infrastructure builds, I had a massive standalone list of missing technologies and Mars-forward considerations at the very end. We see things like GAP FNL 101 for mating pressurized assets, FNL 201 for transferring pressurized cargo, and advanced navigation and sample storage capabilities.
Just a giant list of problems.
It completely killed the momentum of the piece. Putting all the missing technology at the end of the document is like handing an investor a brilliant business plan and then attaching a sticky note at the back that says, "Oh, by the way, we don't currently have electricity." The disconnect is jarring.
That's a great way to describe it. The functional gaps and Mars-forward objectives are currently isolated from the specific phases of the moon base development, obscuring the timeline of when and how these technological hurdles will be overcome.
Because there's no timeline attached to that list at all?
Exactly. The core weakness of this approach is that presenting items like FM302, enable local unpressurized surface mobility, or the broader goal of continuous crew presence as an abstract list at the end completely fails to show how the Ignition project actually solves these problems.
It just leaves the reader hanging.
It forces the reader to flip back and forth through the document to try and deduce which architectural phase is meant to address which specific technological gap.
So the fix here is structural again.
Reorganize the structure to nest the specific functional gaps and Mars-forward considerations directly inside the 3 developmental phases, creating a cohesive roadmap of problem and solution.
Okay, so take them out of the back and sprinkle them throughout the phases.
Exactly. Instead of a block list at the end, integrate the gaps where they belong functionally. Under the section for Phase 2, Establish Early Infrastructure, specifically list gap FNM 302 for unpressurized mobility.
Oh, and then pair it with the solution.
Right. Explicitly state that the introduction of JAXA's Lunar Terrain Vehicle and the 152nd Moonfall drone hops are designed to close this exact gap. And under Phase 3, directly map the delivery of the ASI multipurpose habitats to the goal of closing the surface habitation Mars-forward risk.
For listeners who might not be as familiar with the specific vendor proposals, those Moonfall drone hops refer to the quick, uncrewed recon flights designed to scout terrain ahead of the rovers. Placing that specific solution right next to the mobility gap proves to the reader that the gap is solvable.
It fundamentally changes the tone of the document.
It really does. When you list all the missing functions at the end, the inability to transfer water, the lack of mobility in permanently shadowed regions, the insufficient logistics services, it causes intense reader fatigue. It reads like a wall of insurmountable risk.
It creates immediate project doubt. The reader is left asking, how can we possibly achieve a Mars-forward architecture when we have 30 critical engineering failures listed in the appendix?
But by nesting those gaps directly into the phases, it transforms from a wall of risk into a narrative of triumph. Phase 1 explicitly identifies the functional gap. Phase 2 delivers the commercial payload to test a solution. Phase 3 closes the gap entirely with crewed deployment.
And the amazing thing is, structural editing can reframe reality without changing a single fact.
That's so true.
The data regarding the radioisotope heater units or the UAE-built airlock remains exactly the same. But by moving the functional gaps into the developmental phases, you actively align the architecture's problems with the architecture's solutions.
It's all about placement.
Right. If Phase 1 is designated as Build, Test, Learn, the author should tell the reader exactly which functional gaps are being tested If phase 3 is enable long-duration human presence, that section must be paired directly with the Mars forward considerations, such as advanced navigation and sample conditioning.
Nesting the gaps also establishes a concrete timeline, which I love. When I read about the Mars Design Reference Architecture 5.0 and its requirement to pre-deploy assets before crew arrival, I want to know exactly when NASA plans to demonstrate that capability on the Moon.
You want to see the schedule?
Yeah, placing those requirements inside Phase 2, where the semi-annual crewed missions begin, grounds abstract architectural goals in a scheduled reality. It turns theoretical technology areas into actionable, time-bound milestones.
It brings our discussion full circle to the cross-directorate integration we explored earlier, too. Nesting the gaps visually shows the reader how the Science Mission Directorate's critical need for lunar night survival is being actively solved by the Human Exploration Directorate's Phase 2 nuclear power demonstrations.
Oh, that's a great point.
It takes all the disparate threads of the Artemis program, the international partners, the commercial vendors, these specific science instruments, and weaves them into a single unified roadmap. The reader no longer sees competing interests, they see a synchronized engineering effort.
Well, let's briefly recap the 3 primary takeaways we've explored today. First, we addressed visual cognitive load by separating dense programmatic narratives from highly technical hardware specifications, creating standardized tables and call-out boxes for rapid scanning.
Which makes a huge difference for readability.
Absolutely. Second, we solved the logical navigation issues by introducing explicit bridging paragraphs, replacing chronology with causality to smooth the transitions between the foundational science requirements and programmatic shifts.
Connecting the why to the what.
Exactly. And finally, we transformed a wall of risk into a narrative of triumph by nesting the functional gaps directly within the 3 developmental phases, converting an abstract list of missing technologies into a timeline-driven roadmap of problem resolution.
The depth of research in this material is formidable. I mean, the author's synthesis of international contractor data, budget shifts, and deep dive science traceability forms an incredibly robust foundation. Applying these structural mechanics will focus that research, turning a comprehensive summary into an absolute powerhouse of a document.
We warmly invite the author to implement these structural changes and submit their revised work back to the critique for further exploration. It is a dense, deeply fascinating look at the future of lunar architecture, and ensuring the reader can effortlessly navigate both the data and the logic will make the final piece truly exceptional.